An initiation dream is one in which the unconscious constructs a narrative where you're going through a ritual of sorts that has a very similar structure to rites of passage seen in, say, foraging cultures around the world. It's a very interesting kind of dream that you often see in psychotherapy. And today I'm discussing the meaning of such dreams with Steve and Pauline Richards of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis. So my idea for today was to talk about initiation themes and dreams, something Jungians love to talk about.
Oh, they do.
And of course, I am a Jungian, so I have to jump in on that action as well. I know you guys have some differing positions and opinions on that, but that's cool. That's great. So I thought I would start off with a book that just came out. So what did I do with that? It is a book that I cannot figure out what I did with, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It's called the Jung's Archetype Concept by Professor Christian Russler of he's a German professor, and it's a great book. I do have some issues with it, but that's like a subject for another day. But what really jumped out at me was this dream that he presented of one of his patients in the book. So I feel confident to repeat this because it's already been published anyway, and it's not my patient. And he starts off with this, and it's got an initiation theme to it, to the dream. So there's a patient that he had who had been stagnating for many years. He'd lived in the house of his parents who had died when he was rather young, and he had this really crippling depression, just a lack of motivation, a sense of meaninglessness and emptiness. He was very depressed. And he had this dream while he was in therapy with Dr. Russler, where people from an unknown nationality grabbed him and stripped him, painted him with clay, hit him and poked him, and then dragged him to this big stone altar that had a huge hole in it. They dragged him through the hole painfully. But then once he emerged, everyone celebrated and they all danced around and they carried him to a big feast, and he was celebrated throughout the whole, tribe. And so, obviously you can sense, you can see all of these initiation themes just all over this dream here. And you can see the motifs that you see in initiation ceremonies and rituals around the world are embedded in this. And he didn't have any real background in this. It's something that just sort of emerged from the unconscious in a dream. So my question for discussion today then, well, I was really curious to see what you two would think of a dream like this. What might you think is the meaning of it?
Thank you. I haven't read that book, but what I will say is this is a good book. This is a very good book, and I recommend it highly.
I know that author. I think he's onto something.
He's very good, very good. Yeah. So I've not seen that book, but the concept.
It just came out, so it's really new.
Right. Thank you. I'll make sure to look it up. The context that you've given makes it significant because obviously the context is everything.
Yeah.
And, we would naturally just accept that as being that which manifests itself. We wouldn't try and interpret it away.
Okay.
We'd go along with the presentation of it, and what I would routinely do, working through that with all of the respect that is due for such a thing, at a specific point, I would try because the communication channel has to be open, try and ask the unconscious to further explain beyond the manifest symbols what the deep structure meaning might be. And we do that to avoid what can go wrong with amplification sometimes if we're too strictly Jungian in an approach, in our experience anyway, that you can get a position where we get almost a folie à deux of fantasies going on based on shared suggestion, and things move away from the compensation of the dream, and then we might find that dreams compensate for the interpretation. Wrong.
The dangers of not sticking to the image, possibly.
Yeah. We find, obviously, naturally enough, that the humanistic therapies don't interpret dreams. They say that in their view, the clients, as they call them, is the best expert on themselves. Well, I don't think that's the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the state that they're in.
Right, that's what I say.
But on the other hand, the Jungian enthusiasm for amplification and interpretation can go too far.
Yeah,
So,
get a little bit too happy with that.
Yeah. So our position, based on pretty much everything else we do, is to try to find the right moment to ask the unconscious to explain further. That's as simply as I can put it. So in a way, that would be the transcendent position between the other two. And we do have an evolved view, I guess, of Jungian dream theory, and we kind of default back to Freud in some regards. Not completely, but in part.
How so, would you say?
Well, it's really to do with the view that Jung had, that there was no such thing as a latent content to a dream, manifest content. And of course, he made these statements when he was breaking away from Freud, and it was quite heated. And he may not have really meant it to be that reductive, but he did say that there was no such thing as a dream sensor, for example. The dream presents as it is. Therefore, there is only the manifest content, and there's no latent content which is disguised. He says that, and then he says you have to interpret the symbols of the dream, which imply immediately that there is a latent content between or behind that which manifests. So there's a literal issue there that may not be a true issue, because he may well have understood better what he meant than what he was communicating when he said there is no latent content. But what we do is we say, okay, there's two personalities there, their experiences and their theories collapsed into those personalities, came out the other end as psychoanalysis and analytical psychology, very much predicated on their personality. So what's the bridge? And we thought that the bridge is to ask the other within, on the assumption that that knows what it's doing, even if we don't, and even if the patient or the client themselves doesn't know. And that's congruent with respect to the way that we treat approaching the psyche.
Right. Yeah.
So we would ask, what does this mean? Because we don't understand. Respectfully, really respectfully.
Sure.
And that's a nuanced process.
Yeah. I imagine you would have to set that up to where the respect was accepted and believed.
Yes.
First, right? So there's many ways you have to do that, I imagine, communicating on many channels, et cetera. But I think the classical interpretation of this would be that the dream says exactly what it means. And if you were to ask, just playing devil's advocate here, if you were to ask, I think a classical sort of response to that would be that the dream is in symbols because symbols are the best way to communicate whatever it is. Yeah. But what you're saying is that it's not quite that bad, that you can actually ask the unconscious, hey, I didn't understand that. Could you elaborate a little bit more and help me to figure out what that means? That you'll actually get a creative answer that will assist you in that. Okay.
Yeah, it's unusual if people are unfamiliar with that, because you do have to set aside, as far as is possible, an interpretative theory, except to say that the so-called unconscious is not ego consciousness. They're qualitatively different, and what emerges initially is a statement for sure, as you were saying, on what the position is on the inside, but it doesn't mean that it's been put in a means which is easily accessible to consciousness. It's simply a statement. And Jung's notion on compensation, that the dream might compensate for the attitude of the ego, would suggest that you would expect that. You would expect a simple statement which is in some way compensatory to the ego's position. That's fine if the ego is completely ignoring the unconscious and not making any attempt to approach it. But if it makes an attempt to approach it, we should expect a reaction to that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, given that the dream images are always what they are, but combined with the perception of the ego. And it can change with time as I begin to have a different understanding of, like, my usual example I give is threatening characters or monsters chasing you, and if you in the dream turn around and face those characters, they oftentimes become a whole lot less demonic or threatening. But it must be the same thing that's being expressed, but now the ego attitude has changed the meaning. I also think that you're probably right too, because a given dream is not the final answer. It's the latest answer to what the genome thinks needs to happen, I would say. Right. So, I mean, asking it is now changing the rules.
No.
And so you might get a better answer that way, certainly. I guess the lesson then for us to take home from this is that in your all's experience, it's kind of like religion, like people wringing their hands, or what does God want from me? And somebody comes along and says, well, why don't you just go ask him? Right? Same kind of thing here. It's like, well, what does the unconscious want? What is it trying to mean? Well, why don't you just ask it?
Yeah.
Simple, but probably highly effective.
Yeah. The problem, of course, is that the language of ego consciousness is not the language of the unconscious. So,
right, you got to translate.
Yeah, it's that metaphor we use of going back to the 19th century, the sort of, the high point of the British Empire. The Englishman abroad speaks to the locals who don't understand him, so he shouts louder, thinking that's true. Well, the ego, if it does that, will get a similar response to the 19th century Englishman abroad. It might be unpleasant.
Yeah, spirit of the face.
It's been avoided.
Right.
So if we respectfully say, thank you, I'd like to understand more, and then be patient, then there's usually a response. And we have a few other little things that we do as well when we engage with dreams to help to open up that channel of communication.
So now, if you were to speculate then, given that we don't have this patient here to ask directly like that, what might you think the meaning of this dream is? Or if you've seen dreams like this in other folks, what's a common answer to that you get?
Well, I would say that it's latent potential, and we go back to manifest and latent again. Although there's a manifest content that represents itself to ego consciousness when the ego is in the dream ego state, it's unlikely to be being lived out. So it's in potentia and therefore latent. So it represents latent potential, or a push from instincts and therefore the genome, anticipating a future that is possible. And it represents itself as a process which is attainable. But the ego is not articulated to that at this stage, hence the dream compensates in that traditional Jungian way, but it will present in that way.
And that might be why it would present as a quote unquote primitive ritual like this, even though he doesn't live in a society like that.
Yeah,
right? The disconnect between the way he's living now and the way the dream presents, I think, is significant.
Yeah. We would take that as being an indication of a meta instinct, which Jungians, of course, call archetypes.
Yeah.
And a quick way of accessing that is to find an affect pulse, which very often is concealed. It is literally latent behind a dream image, which someone can articulate about very clearly. And they say, this is this is that. But if they can find a glimpse or feel a glimpse of what is behind the manifest content, the first thing that happens is you get a confirming affect pulse, which is something from the unconscious that's coded. The superpositioned information is in an affect charge at that point. And it announces, yes, that's a signal. Yes, you're on the right track. Feel this. And what they do about the feeling then is important, because the feeling being a pulse is likely to be overwhelming, but there will be a vague impression of something just behind even the emotion at that point. And that's the indication of the direction to go. And at that point,
like in this case, how would you do that? How would you propose something that you might get a pulse like that from in this instance?
Well, obviously we'd hear the narrative explained, and depending on the state of the person, it might be just a cognitive thing. They literally just describe it with no feeling connection at all. And we've noticed very often therapists will try to, at that point, to induce a feeling in the person, even if they just say, well, what does that mean to you? And you'll usually find the person stirs off and has to recalibrate their attention cognitively to try to construct something, because they've been interfered with at the moment when they were about to shift from cognition into affect. So we have the complete story, first of all, and then just ask them about a part of it which may indicate something to them about what it really means, whatever that might be. And then just say something at the right moment. What do you think is just behind that? For example, I know that that's not a particularly good way of phrasing it, because this is an abstraction, but in essence, that's what we're looking for. And very often they'll get it, the affect charge, and say, "Oh, where does that come from? I don't know what that means. It means something," and they might actually start to cry. To have a true abreaction, change in respiration, a big sigh, or something like, or all of those. And then they might say, "I know what it means," but they can't say it. So at that point, they're in a dissociative state. They know that the affect means that they know, but they can't access the affect level of consciousness because they're still in cognition.
Okay.
But they're actually going away from the dream, but inwardly away and not outwardly away. The usual Jungian method of amplification moves them away, outwardly away, not inwardly away. But the inwardly away is actually a deepening of connection to what what lies behind it. And there may well be then that narrative that starts to open up. And once they start to articulate that, then with encouragement, they can start to deepen that and go into a very primitive state of association to their instincts. And that can get, I know from my own experience, personal experience, that gets really powerful.
Yeah, I've had experiences like that in therapy myself too, and it does get intense. And I think that you're right, that there is that is an error that is made in therapy sometimes, is taking the imagery and then flying off into massive, worldwide connections and amplifications, all that stuff, and you're losing the reason why this person had this dream right now. Right. And so it's best, I think, to try to do that in your head, to maybe get some feel for where it is, and then try to move towards, well, what are these images representing for you? What is, like you say, right behind that? What's the affect that is being clothed in those images, to use Warren Coleman's phrase? And so, like, what kind of a question would you ask to get that for this person?
I'll start with what I wouldn't do, if that's okay. And that would, only because it provides the ground for the figure, so to speak. But what I wouldn't do is analyze every detail and say, okay, you put on the clay, you passed through this stone, that's a rebirth. I'm already telling him what it is. And I'm stepping away, and that's me, and it's not him, and it's not his dream. And I would anticipate the unconscious would resist. And how it resists at that point is to withdraw communication in the moment, and we're left on the level of cognition. And that cognition is suggestion, because if the patient accepts it, then they're listening to hopefully a rationalistic statements about the report of the dream, but they're not engaged with it emotionally at all. And so they come away with a superficial sensation, they've been understood, and afterwards the yawning gap with the affect, which is there, but exercising a gravitational pull on their ego that makes them feel a bit, that tells them, no, that wasn't satisfactory at all. So that's what we don't do.
Okay, good. I agree with that.
So some of the demonstration tapes that I've done for IPSA with James, where he's gone into dreams, again, using imagery, allows the unconscious to have its say. And the interesting thing for us is that the unconscious doesn't do that by choice through speech. It does it through other channels of expression initially. So what we're looking for basically is to superposition what is unconscious into consciousness, so they're in a state, and they translate directly, and then the person gets the sense of meaning. And to do that, we have to find the signals that the unconscious is delivering in that moment and favors at that time. And again, this is where a hypnotic or altered states of consciousness modality is very, very useful, because a person can actively, but in a relaxed way, observe their unconscious beginning to move physically through them, or through an affect change, through a whole process of imagery coming through without being pressured, and then deciding to speak when they want to. And then we can start to talk directly to the unconscious mind of whoever that person is. We can talk to both. it gets very weird, and you start to feel things yourself, because it's a relational field
Yeah.
where you're picking up something that resonates with yourself. And that's a very deep level of rapport, and things can progress very quickly. Then it's an exhausting process, because your whole physiology becomes attuned to the experience of the other, which is being detected and exchanged.
Right. So you end up with this kind of well, that would, I think, be typically labeled as like a manifestation of the transcendent function.
Yeah.
I think, or you could call it an analytic third if you wanted to.
You can do that very quickly using.
Yeah.
You see, it doesn't take a long time. You just have to do the right things, and the communication occurs. Just that we don't have to wait years to be able to dream. The dream is a natural process. So if we facilitate that communication channel, the unconscious will manifest immediately in the way that it needs to. The theory gets in the way.
Yeah, it can. Yeah. And it's supposed to clarify things, but sometimes it sort of runs on its own motor and flies off into outer space. But in this case, so then what you're saying is what you would have them do is go kind of back into the dream, right? Sort of immerse themselves into the dream.
Yeah.
And in a way of helping them access sort of an unconscious answer to the question of what is the meaning behind this.
Yeah. If the patient was to say, I am being reborn, and I haven't said, or Pauline, either of us have said that, that's completely different than one of us saying that's a ritual rebirth. The gap between those two statements is vast.
Yeah.
If we say it, they're very close, they're almost there.
And then you would want to know what that feels like for them.
Do you know what I
would probably not.
No. What we want to know is what it means.
Yes. Yeah.
And the only reason for us to want to know what it means is it would have to pass through him to be able to articulate what that means. So it would go from instinct to affect consciousness to cognitive consciousness, and then psychosocial. And that would all line up because it came from within and hadn't been imposed from without.
Okay. So it's kind of like making sure all of the channels are aligned with like a bunch of Swiss cheese, right? All the holes have to be there, or if you get that right at the unconscious.
Professor, are you familiar with Doctor Who at all?
No, I'm not. I've heard a lot about it, but I've never seen it.
You know a lot about sci-fi and the like.
Yeah. That's one I've never gotten into yet, but I plan to.
The original series is very interesting for me, anyway, because I remember it in 1963 when it was first broadcast, and the character of the Doctor regenerates within that universe into a different personality, a different configuration, and on occasion, over the original 30 years or so that it was running, one or more of these personalities would be present at the same time for a specific task, because the universe decided it needed more than one version of them. And in one scenario, there's a guy who was very much a practical sensing type in the Jungian sense, and another who was all over the place and intuitive, and they were trying to solve a problem. And the problem was laid out on a sarcophagus in script. And the intuitive said, what does that mean? And the sensing type read it out, read out exactly what it said. And the intuitive said, I know what it says, but what does it mean? And I've never forgotten that.
Yeah.
They were both right.
Both
right. The guy who read it out knew what it meant, but he didn't communicate what it meant. He only said what it meant. But the other guy wanted to know, what is the meaning behind the manifestation of the script that will solve the problem for us? And because they were opposites in a Jungian sense, sensing and intuition, they're actually in conflict with one another. You got two partial answers, but and it took the thinking type guy to turn up and sort them both out.
Of course,
yeah. And there was a feeling type that there were four of them, and each one of them manifested that kind of thing. But the metaphor there for me is, what does it mean? I know what it says because you told me, but what does it mean? Once I know what it means, and then that person knows what it means, then the channel opens and we get somewhere.
Okay. So then just kind of further speculating here, since we don't have the patient with us to experiment on. Why might you think that someone would have a dream with tribal, this sort of tribal initiation elements to it?
Well, what about you, Paul? I'm okay on that one. How about you? What do you think?
Well, I think we would have to say that there's some kind of instinctive pressure there for maybe some new form or phase of adaptation, trying to make itself known. And we're not of today. We are ancients. The way the brain evolved as well is the deeper structures are very ancient, and to some extent, we still have those same instincts, the ones that were formed way back, in Paleolithic times, back in the old Stone Age. So to me, it just suggests really that the something has to be done with that instinctive pressure. And I was thinking before we sort of came on air tonight about some of the, I know I'm moving away a little bit from the example that we're talking about now, but it's to do with sort of the Jungian take on these things. And it was a Jungian analyst who has to some extent stepped away from her work now, unfortunately, but her name is Clarissa Pinkola Estes. You're probably familiar with her, wrote a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And she talks about things like dark man dreams, that women have these dark man dreams when they're being required from within to enter a new phase of adaptation, or to update themselves with respect to their consciousness and their maturation and so on. And as far as it goes, I can kind of, excuse the pun, run with that. But the problem I have with it too is that she then tends to reify it by talking about the negative animus, and how if women don't take on board the message from the animus, then it will act as a destructive force within them, and all this kind of stuff. And I just think that's moving further and further away from the point, really, which for me is one again of instinctive pressure more than anything else. I just think that's a cleaner way, a safer way to come at it than to start to reify the contents in that way. So I know it's a bit of an aside from what we're talking about, but that's why we tend to fall back, I think, on instincts as much as we do.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I write about instincts all the time.
Of course you do. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So it sounds like you're saying that the reason why these sort of tribal initiation elements in it pop up is because that is a ancient way of solving this problem of stagnation that he's experiencing. And it's at this moment anyway, the psyche is saying this sort of thing needs to happen.
Yes.
And that the instincts are pushing towards that. Yes. But I agree too that it is dangerous to get overly involved with the labeling of this is the animus and that is the shadow and all that kind of thing, because then you can get lost. I always remind myself of something Jung said in one of his seminars, was that learn everything you can about symbolism and then forget about it when you walk into the room.
Yes.
Yes. So it's like, be prepared to potentially look and see that if it's there, but at the end of the day, still, you don't want to put that on them. You want to see what's actually there. Stick to the image. He kept saying that.
Yeah.
But I think that the tendency for some of his followers to do stuff like that was probably why he said, "Thank God I am young and not a Jungian."
Yes. Well, I think you're right to emphasize that idea of putting theory in the way, and it's easy to do, particularly I think when maybe we don't know somebody very well, and there's all the angst in that person for you to help them solve their problems. And you get further, if you do that, get further and further away from your own ability to literally feel into where that person is and where they're going. And if you say something at the wrong moment, as I think Steve was saying earlier. You ask them how they feel, or you interject in some other way when they're about to have some kind of meaningful experience. Essentially, you rob them of it if you're not careful. And it's a hard thing to articulate because it's a very nuanced thing, really. But this idea of that kind of deep rapport that you have with somebody that guides you through the process is very hard to articulate. And it does require you to let go of, over analyzing things yourself in the moment with that person, and it can feel, it can feel a bit be the right word, a bit scary almost to do that sometimes, because there's a kind of, to some extent, you have to go with the process. I mean, Jung would also say things too, like that he would be in the soup with that other person, and to some extent you are, without being necessarily sort of lost in it, but you just very, very attuned, I think, to what they're going through. And I guess it's just something that the more that you do it, the more comfortable that you get with it.
Yeah, there's some interesting writing by Heinz Kohut on that, talking about the difference, if you're familiar with his work, between sympathy and empathy, and how empathy is the primary tool that we use in therapy. And I think the tendency to overanalyze and whatever is probably a newbie error, because you go in and you don't have any idea what's going on, but you've got this comforting theory you can fall back on and go, oh, I know what this is. So there might even be some inflation there too, that's tempting us to jump on the gun there and say, oh, well, this is clearly blah 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 blah. But that's not really what you should be doing. Of course.
I mean, it's still informing you. I mean, as you're going through that process with that person, or sharing that process with them, it's not that you're not aware of what might be going on. You can still have that tape running in your head. It's just that you're not so focused on it that you allow it then to intrude on something which is potentially a very, very special, very profound moment for someone. And I think, as Steve was suggesting, sometimes it happens so quickly. I think it can take everyone by surprise. So you kind of have to be prepared for it. But you still have different channels running, don't you, whilst you're doing what you're doing. And so it's possible afterwards to maybe think more analytically about things, and to have a kind of a debrief with yourself, or with the person concerned, or with whoever's doing your supervision. But in that moment, it's so important to think not to disturb that channel as it opens up. It's very tempting to sometimes as well, particularly if there's maybe a long silence, or you're not quite sure yourself where that person's at. There's a little bit of a mismatch in your energy with their energy, and it's all of that. And like I said, it's very nuanced. But I think
dance.
Yes, it is. It is, definitely. Yes. But you do know for sure, I think, as Steve said, that if they offer something themselves rather than you impose it, and they say, well, that was like a rebirth for me, and it's come from them, that is so much more powerful than imposing it.
Right. Because you can listen. This maybe is what Jung means by learning about it, but then forgetting it, is to say, like you say, keep it in the back of your head. If I'm hearing this dream, I'm like, oh, okay, this has got a whole lot of tribal rebirth, initiation into adulthood, all that kind of stuff. But if I say that, I'm messing it up. I'm messing up the field.
Yes.
Which of course, I agree with that. I don't do that.
Yeah.
Now, and one thing I try to do too, though, is always ask myself, why is it this way and not some other way? Why is this? If we're right, and this is a dream expressing an instinctive push to progress and mature out of this state of stagnation, which I think is probably the case. But then why is it presenting like this, like a primitive so-called ritual, that's very removed from his actual life experience? Is that because it's just so distant from the ego that it's going to manifest like that? Like this is something that we need to, that the instincts are saying, this is something you need to go through, but you don't have a clue. So it's kind of like this thing from ancient times, right? You know, the 2 million year old self is talking at that point. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very interesting point. And as Pauline was talking then, and you said as well, Professor, about the rebirth element, if we wanted to induce a trance, when somebody says that, that's, this sounds awful, but it's an ambush opportunity. And by that, I mean, the ego is in a position that it's placed itself by its own articulation, which it will only be partially conscious of, about using that term to be moved from that state of self-reflection in the moment into something else, which we could call metaphorically an ancestral state of resonance. So to get away from the complexity of what I've just said, it would be something along the lines of, and when were you first born? And only say that, and you're doing something else, as if you'd said it under your breath, but you say it very directly. When was he first born? And then if he doesn't say anything and he's sitting there and he's contemplating it, perhaps in a dissonant way, that's okay, because the door is now open. The dissonance provides the door for you to begin to ask the psyche to take him back to when such a ritual meant so very much. And then to begin to feel that connection with an ancestral spirit. So something which appears incongruent now because it has a very primitive Paleolithic, perhaps Mesolithic certainly, overlay to it, then surely we should invite the ego to allow itself to go back into that context.
Yeah, so you could say that it's that way for a very specific reason.
In the moment about whether that's right or not. And if, as Pauline was saying about the nuance of the rapport, and you mentioned empathy, similar concept, if that's presence and you feel it within you, and it'll very often be a somatic register, you'll feel it in your guts. You have to say
you will, the therapist, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That you have to say it. And then you have to watch yourself that you don't take the journey over and do it for them. But you're simply present but separate from them. And that's a dissociative framework. Again, it's saying I'm not going to associate myself to this person's experience insofar as to control it, but simply to make a statement at what appears to be the right moment. And the justification for that is that they have said it. And I often say to people that their unconscious, so-called, however we conceive of that, is present and monitoring the situation. And very often,
always listening.
Yes, and very often people say things and they catch that I didn't actually say that so much as it said itself. So therefore there is the other presence. And again, depending on how well we've prepared someone, very subtly with analogically marked anchors that we can then go back to and align again, a person can get back into that state of, yeah, this is the time and the moment and I'm on my way. You feel it. It's part of the rapport field. And as you said earlier, if the unconscious trusts you, their unconscious and your own unconscious trusts you to do what you're trying to do, then that's part of that informational field, that resonant field, and it surfaces as what the youngers would call an intuition, probably, and then you go with it.
Or they would use maybe the metaphor of the therapeutic window, where there's the conscious and the conscious talking, and the unconscious of the therapist and the patient talking, underneath the radar, with that communication going on. And then there's of course the cross channels too, like I'm seeing that your unconscious doing stuff, and then transference and countertransference.
Yeah, you see that in Jung's work, don't you, a lot. And I think it's a very handy schemata to represent what's going on. In practice, though, of course, you disregard the schematic representation and go entirely on being present and feeling the flow of that movement.
Yeah.
It's interesting what can happen. I spontaneously modeled that as you were both speaking, because my own psyche has told me on the basis of experience that is the opportunity. to begin a dissociation. And very often it's a deepening or a secondary dissociation because the person's already in that state, because they're recounting a dream. So there's a withdrawal of attention in the immediate moment from the environment externally, and it's internal. And then they give you a signal which they think they've said, and they've authored the statement, but it's come from within, and it's the invitation to help them to take the next step. And you do.
It's a kind of functional shamanism, really.
It is, yeah.
And oftentimes when someone gets the experience that they need, and there's a state change for them, sometimes there is for you as well. It's not always in a positive direction. No. In the same way as it might be, in the kind of shamanism that even exists in some parts of the world today, where
basically it's a transference, isn't it?
Well, it is. But I think to think of it in those terms automatically gives it a more ancient feel.
Oh, it does.
And so it does. Because we're talking about instincts and how ancient they are, and there's just something I think about attuning yourself in that way psychologically to what you're doing that actually changes what you're doing.
Yes, it
as
does.
Opposed to saying, I'm here, and I'm a Jungian analyst and I'm going to amplify this dream for someone. Mm. It's an entirely different mindset to knowing that you may engage in some kind of shamanistic experience with someone soon, and that you better be ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And I think this is true about many kinds of therapy, is that it's almost like you take the material that they give you, and then you tell them in one way or another, okay, now we're going to go do some homework assignments on this and analyze it over here, independently of your lived experience right now in this moment.
Yes.
We're going to go over here, we're going to analyze it from afar, and then we're going to come back and maybe that'll help. And even when I was a resident, I used to ask myself, sometimes I would ask questions that they didn't find very amusing, but I think like, okay, so how does this help exactly? And I would get dirty looks from some folks, but it's a problem. It is a problem, and that the rise of sort of cookbook CBT is another example of this sort of thing. Is I'm taking your feelings and what you're telling me, and it's almost like I'm extracting it and sticking it under a microscope over here, rather than saying, let's do something right now here in this very instant together. It's very much like a mantic exercise, like you say.
Yeah.
Well, there's a reason why that stuff's been around for so long.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mantic practices have been around forever because they are powerful and effective. I remember reading a book called The Neuroscience of Religious Experience by a guy named Patrick McNamara. It's a really, really interesting book. I was annoyed at first when I saw it because it was so close to what I was talking about with the neurobiology of the gods when I read it. But then I actually read it and I realized he was actually getting into a very different subject.
Yeah.
And he was talking about what's going on in the brain and in the mind during these sorts of mantic practices, the dissociative nature of it. You might find it interesting if you haven't read it. It's a really cool book. Mm-hmm. But also warning of the dangers of what can happen and go wrong, and inflation and all that sort of stuff too. It was really interesting. Didn't mention Jung at all, but he should have.
Yes. Yeah.
It was very relevant.
Sorry, just to clarify on transference, I did not mean to reduce that to a Freudian or a Jungian interpretation of that, but what's supposed to underlie that as transference, as in the shamanistic transference of something onto the other, so that the other bears it in the moment and holds it as a containing vessel. Yeah. Now that can act as a dissociation too, and I've done this. I think I've done it with James on some of the videos that we've done for our training courses. Well, when he's been in a double situation of double induction, doubly dissociated, then I've allowed or suggested that some things can be projected onto me that will reduce the tension in him at the moment as a complete system, so he can observe himself in a less stressed or less pushed way. And the transference then manifested itself completely openly, undisguised, and I was able to contain that. without harm to him or to me. And that's a shame. That's what I meant by it is a transference in that sense, that
Yes,
when it's shamanistic, you take things off, you take the illness or whatever it might be, metaphorically.
Yeah, that's a very different way of looking at transference from the classical.
Yes.
Typically pejorative almost way of looking at transference is a sort of negative thing that you have to try to get around or avoid or all that.
Yeah, it's transference. Well, I think of it as again superpositioning. What is within, so too is without, through the dynamic of transference. So it's the same information, but it collapses into a specific kind of representation. And if it's targeted on us as therapists, it's not pleasant. But if that can be reconfigured and re-understood and communicated back, even if it's indirectly, then everything changes. The field adjusts. The homeostasis of the field adjusts. So how it's dealt with is important, I think.
Yeah, I'd say so. Well, okay. So I was going to ask, like, what you would do in a situation like this, but I think you've already answered that question.
I think it depends what came up, obviously. But I'd really be interested in his capacity to comfortably separate himself from that which comes from within, so that which comes from within can express itself, and he'll feel no fear, no anxiety, nothing like that.
That's a really key principle there, then, I think, for your approach, isn't it? That you really have to accept the reality of the ego being quite separate from the unconscious, so that there can be a real true dialogue. I think so many times the tendency is to just collapse everything onto the, well, why did you do that? Or why did you say that? As if it was only one singular center of consciousness going on in there.
Yeah.
Right. So with the discovery of the unconscious and all these possible different complexes going on all at once, we know there's many voices in here, but it's not pathological except in a few cases of severe trauma and schizophrenia and stuff. Other than that, it's supposed to function that way.
Yes, it is. So dissociation is normal. The first level, I think, of depth is that the field of complexes, as we would call them, particularly those identified with by the ego, because there's no separation as such. As by definition, is identification, and that gets a very crowded place. And if we don't utilize dissociation, we hit that wall, and there's a great deal of inertia and distraction amongst these things, because they've partitioned in order to deal with something that the ego wasn't able to deal with, and then run autonomously and will act against the ego's best interests in favor of the conditions that set the complex up. That's what it does. But if you can get past that, so it doesn't even matter, that's a very strange situation for the ego, but also for the complexes associated with the ego. They start to think, where am I? I don't know. I've lost my orientation. What's going on?
Right. The little satellites, and then they're just spinning off into space now.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting experience to subjectively to go through that, to actually not be bothered by these little things anymore.
Well, Jung talks about the function of consciousness as discernment, as dividing and breaking things down so that they can be understood. This is the same process on a larger scale. Yeah. If I can't dissociate, then I can't allow the elements of the whole to be distinct. I just jam them all together, and it's just this big soup of confusion.
Yeah.
Right. So then that makes sense to use that as a tool.
Yes. And of course, when we dissociate, we leave the ego in place, and we leave it feeling comfortable with itself rather than panicking. And I think there's a reasonable reason, so to speak, why we should panic at the idea of fragmenting. Because that's inclining towards the kind of work that you very often have to do in your profession. Yeah. But if we're not afraid of that, because the ego is stable but separate, that's a very different set of circumstances.
Right. Yeah, it is. There are actually quite a bit of research on kind of the evolutionary background of schizophrenia. And there's some theorists that think that the capacity that we have for language imagination and dissociation and all that sort of thing that schizophrenia is kind of a side effect of that. Like we evolved these things, and that came along with it, because if we couldn't do those things, right, they serve a purpose. They're functional. We need them.
Yeah.
And so the only way that could have evolved, though, was for it to go, the potential for it to go too far, in which case you would have fragmentation and all that. It's one of the theories out there. But if you've ever heard the theory that that shamans and things like that were schizophrenics and tribes, no, they're too disorganized for that. Schizophrenics are. No, they might be considered touched by the gods or special or things like that, but people that actually go through what typical folk magicians and mantic practitioners have to go through to do what they do, I think it would be almost impossible for a schizophrenic to tolerate, because they have to. It's an immense amount of work usually.
Yeah, I'd agree. And do you think? How do you feel about this? I'd be very interested to hear, obviously, with your experience and professional knowledge on this. This delusional beliefs. Obviously, there are different levels of intensity, and it can become psychotic, obviously. But our own view sometimes is that appears to be, from a psychodynamic perspective, the complex is attempting to generate a meta instinct to explain something that is pushing them that they can't deal with. So the delusion very often is systematized, obviously, and it makes sense from within itself. But there's a narrative very often to it, and that's very close to the idea of a meta instinct, which should be healing, but it's not healing. So it's almost as if there's an attempt to do it. And the reason I think now is that my experience with complexes is they do something similar. They will generate a pseudo meta instinct as an alibi narrative to keep themselves in an ecology that the ego will accept.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah, a lot of times I think they are at the service of ego needs, or at least ego desires, particularly like folks that have, and this is kind of the gray area between the psychodynamic and the psychotic, that Jung was so good at identifying because of the patients he worked with. But like a person who has this paranoid belief that he's being watched and followed all the time, that tends to happen in folks that are very isolated. And so what you do the same thing with the delusions that you would with a dream or with any other sort of symptom dynamically, is ask yourself, what is this thing doing for that person? And in this case, it's sort of like saying, I'm important enough for these vague entities to be following me around and monitoring my otherwise completely mundane and uninteresting day-to-day activities. Why anybody would go through the trouble of monitoring me wandering around in my kitchen, it just doesn't make any sense. But the ego is not strong enough to handle that. It's too fragile. And so it hangs on to this narrative. I have one patient who believed that she was royalty, descended from Queen Victoria, and that she would drive her family crazy because she was constantly telling them the story about how they stole her from the royal family, and they were just, fed up with all that sort of talk. But what does that sort of narrative do? I mean, it's a classic archetypal narrative of the sort of divine child story, or the hero's journey kind of thing. They've got this divine background and all that kind of thing. So it services the I'm important.
Yeah.
That in a very, very blunt sort of way.
Yeah.
So does that? I think that I'm agreeing with what your interpretation of those things are.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very enlightening.
Yeah. So I think it does what you say it does. That it is there for a purpose, but it's kind of pulled off from the greater picture, the bigger picture. It's more like the ego is in such dire straits here. It's so fragile. It needs something to hold it together. And so we're going to come up with this, like you say, alibi narrative. I like that term. To keep it together for right now. It's kind of like an abscess in the immune system. Right. Okay. We can't defeat this thing, so we're just going to wall it off and hope for the best.
And that is how complexes function too, as well. And
Yeah.
fantasy, when it's wrongly attributed, should we say, as being something that's positive, only where it's wrongly attributed, performs a similar function for a neurotic ego rather than a fragmented schizophrenic one, perhaps, as you were saying.
Yeah. 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 Fascinating stuff.
It is, yeah. I really enjoyed. Well, we both do really enjoy talking with you.
All right. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about and get into today with you guys. So I really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts and your
Thank you.
methods. They're just absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Paul, you wanted to?
I was just going to briefly add to what you were saying, because it's a very, very sort of interesting subject, but it's partly too why we tend to not chase complexes unless we absolutely have to, because, as you rightly say, for some people, they would fracture under that pressure, and to some extent, you have to kind of respect the narratives that have been put in place to protect the ego. So it's if you can do the work from the inside out without that person even knowing it's taking place, it's probably the safest way to do it.
What I did for that one particular patient with the Victorian ancestry, I said I didn't challenge it or fight it, because obviously that wasn't going to get me anywhere. Instead, I worked with, okay, so now that you're here, now what? And she said, well, I guess I'm just going to have to accept the fact that even though I have this special background, I may not ever get to really reconnect with it. And maybe that's okay. And I thought, well, okay, all right. I didn't give her that answer. I was asking her what she thought it meant, because it's just a kind of question you tend not to ask folks with delusional beliefs, because you don't, I guess there's this fear that we're going to make it worse by encouraging them. It doesn't work like that. You can't create delusions, right? They build them up.
They come from within, don't they?
Yeah, they do. That's when you were speaking about it, I thought I was quite close to the idea of the changeling as well. It's to some extent, it's just a matter of degree, isn't it, as to how connected people are to the ideas that they have. What point does it go from being something that is, I guess, basically neurotic to something which is psychotic and therefore, by definition, a more serious condition. But you can see the elements either way would be the same, as in this person maybe simply isn't fulfilling their genomic potential in some way, and maybe it's the genome intruding into psychology, if you like, or trying to make itself known in that way, and encourage that person to fulfill themselves in the way that they ought to, and it may be that's equal and opposite to the extent to which they've not done that. Who knows? But
that's certainly a possibility. I've seen that work like that. Yeah. And in one person, that might be a fantasy that they've latched onto with great interest and passion, but they don't truly believe it. They're just fascinated with stories like that. And then in another person, that exact same instinctive pressure evolves into a full-blown delusion. For neuroscientific reasons, or whatever, however it plays out. But I think the instinct behind it, like you say, is the same. It's really very similar. Like you have a purpose, you have a destiny, you have a specialness to you.
That's right. Yes.
And we need you to go out there and find out and do it for the species, for the genome, for whatever. And if the ego can't handle that, it doesn't work. You get these other things.
Fascinating.
Well, we've covered a lot.
It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Me too.
Yes, I have too. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'll be in touch with you soon.
Yes, we will.
We'll talk some more.
Great.
It'd be wonderful. Thank you.
So
Blessings,
much.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
See you soon.